There is one event in human history that baffles the mind. An event so impactful, so shocking, so spectacular, yet so horrific that one can barely look away. It is an event filled with contradictions, filled with a frenetic energy and a chaotic spirit rarely seen in the modern world that pit reason against violence, religion against rationalism and humanist ideals, and law and order versus chaos in a way never seen before. It is an event that puzzles the mind, for one must ask how rational and conscientious individuals devoted to reason and morality, most of them lawyers and some even priests, were at the same time failing to adhere to the simplest principles of jurisprudence. How the main proponents of morality within a people's murder and beheaded their own friends, or how the illuminated children of the Enlightenment descended to the farthest depths of despair before being reborn under a new and simple motto: Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. This event was none other than La Révolution Française, the French Revolution. In trying to take apart and reconstruct the French Revolution, the first thing that must be studied and fully understood is l'Ancien Régime, the old order, if you will, the ancient regime, and the many traditions that existed in France since the Capetian dynasty. You see, on July 3rd, 987 CE, in order for Hugh Capet to be voted, keyword voted, the king of the Franks at Noyon by the many nobles of the kingdom after the fall of the Carolingian dynasty, that famous dynasty established by the accomplishments of Charles Martel, Pepin the Short, and Charlemagne, the nobles of France wrestled from the monarchy incredible concessions and powers over their own king. During Hugh Capet's reign, France was divided into 15 great realms that were almost semi-autonomous kingdoms of their own, functioning under the total power of feudal lords, those same nobles who voted Hugh Capet king. They were the Duchy of Aquitaine, or the Duchy of Guyenne, the Duchy of Normandy, the Duchy of Burgundy, the Duchy of Brittany, the County of Flanders, the County of Champagne, often encompassing the lands of Troyes, the County of Anjou, the County of Blois, the County of Toulouse, the County of Maine, the County of Poitou, the County of Vermandois, the County of Auvergne, and the County of Gascony, along with the royal domain, the Ile-de-France d'Orléans, the only areas directly under the control of Hugh Capet and his children. In all reality, the monarch himself was close to being a prisoner in his own capital, the city of Paris, surrounded by all these nobles and their immense estates. His later descendants managed over time to wrestle back some of the authority given away by Hugh Capet's monarchy. But this authority came as a result of more concessions to the nobles in the form of transforming the curias regis, or royal law courts, used by Hugh Capet to convene with his vassals and deliberate on feudal and political matters, into the curias in Parlamento, or the Parlement, the courts. At first, this Parlement was only located in Paris, but quickly as it grew in importance, it also grew in its complexity, and other Parlements were established in the provinces, 13 in total, where bailies, or the king's administrative officers of the region, dispensed justice, often in tyrannical ways. By the 12th century, the offices of the conciliari, or advisors, were added to the curia in Parlement. And by 1250, the Parlement de Paris was hearing appeals against the judgment of bailies in the provinces. So it had become, in essence, a supreme court. The political pretensions of the Parlement that would come into play during the French Revolution were based on their registration of the king's laws, or king's edicts, and letters patent or privileges and dignities granted by the king. You see, before registering a new measure, the parlements examined it to see that it conformed with the principles of law and justice and with the interests of the king and the realm. And if it did not, they withheld registration and addressed reasons for opposition or grievances to the king. In other words, they would counsel the king on the laws he had approved before, so that he wouldn't be passing contradicting orders or contradicting laws. If the king, however, wished to force registration, he had to order it in a letter or appear before the Parlement in a special session called the lit de justice, literally the bed of justice, a term originally used to describe the seat the king occupied in these proceedings, where his presence alone would suspend any delegation of authority to his magistrates, and in essence would overturn any opposition by the Parlement or the courts. This power, the power to check and remind the king of his previous commitments, was immense power. It was the power to, in essence, interpret the law, but not just that. By opposing the will of the king, they were able to slow down some of the king's more rash decisions and acts, and remind him of his previous oaths and commitments. Again, in order for him to bypass this system, the king would have to show up in person, in court, and cannot throw a temper tantrum in front of his magistrates to force the registration of his will, if he was deemed there was a contradiction or a conflict in a new law. Using these powers during the 16th and 17th centuries, the Parlement took up a course of systematic opposition to the crown. As a result, this activity was restricted under Louis XIV, the supreme Sun King, who would have cared less about anyone's counsel, saw conspiracy in trusting others, and who punished the Parlement by severely restricting the right to oppose the king for nearly 50 years. It was resumed in the 18th century, though, as we already established. But by that time, the opposition of the members of the Parlement to the king was largely motivated by their desire to maintain their own privileges and their own power, and to never allow a monarch to humiliate them and take them for granted like Louis XIV had. Nevertheless, these attempts at conciliation by the Duc d'Orléans as regent, and later Louis XV as monarch, only served to amplify and focus more general feelings of political and social discontent. Another major concession was the establishment of the États Généraux, the Estates General, or Representative Assembly, the first of which took place on April 10, 1302 in Notre Dame in Paris, where the three estates discussed the conflict between the king, Philip IV, and the Pope at the time, Boniface VIII. Now, you see, in February 1296, the Pope, Boniface VIII, issued the bull or holy law, or God's orders known as Clericis Laicos, prohibiting kings from taxing the clergy without papal approval. The point was to stop King Philip IV of France and Edward I of England, Longshanks, from heavily taxing the church on his properties to fund their wars. Philip IV, who was offended by this threat to his authority and his treasuries, responded with retaliatory measures, forcing Pope Boniface VIII to retreat, and in July 1297 to reclaim the legitimacy and legality of clerical taxation without the Pope's permission, when the ruler attested its necessity. In other words, Philip IV forced the Pope to walk back his words and take back his own law. A king, making the representative of God on earth according to the Holy Roman Catholic Church, rethink one of his commandments. But this was not the end of it. The Pope was not going to take it lying down. New grounds for dispute developed again in 1301 when Philip IV arrested Bernard Saisset, the Bishop of Palmiers, as a suspected traitor to France. Pope Boniface VIII, who had just celebrated in the year 1300 a papal jubilee, the first one of its kind, was overflowing with confidence about his authority superseding that of kings, and was determined to not only force Philip IV to send Saisset to Rome, where he, the Pope, would be safe, but also determined to launch a renewed frontal attack on King Philip IV's authority. In December 1301, Boniface VIII once again suspended Philip's rights to tax ecclesiastics, priests, monks, archbishops, etc., and summoned the French clergy, the leaders of the French church, to Rome to discuss the king's governance and the state of the French church. In other words, he was telling King Philip IV, I'm going to prove to you I'm more powerful than you are in your own kingdom. If you were one of those bishops and you refused the Pope's request, you would be violating God's words. But if you took the side of the Pope and attended without the king's permission, you would be crossing a very jealous king, a man prone to anger, a murderous king. Philip IV allowed Bishop Saisset to go to Rome, but Boniface's other measures encountered immediate resistance. On December 5, 1301, the Pope issued another papal bull or decree, the Ausculta Fili, an official order this time directly directed at King Philip, using strict paternal terms, pointing out the wrongs of the king to his kingdom, the church, and the state, and asking him to do penance and mend his way. Listen, son, let no one persuade you that you have no superior or that you are not subject to the head of the ecclesiastical hierarchy, for he is a fool who so thinks. Philip, in furious anger, had it burned on February 10, 1302 in Paris in front of a large crowd and ceremoniously invoke curses on any of his sons who dare subordinate the kingdom to any power other than God's himself. These meant war against the church in Rome. As a papal response, on March 4, 1302, Pope Boniface VIII sent Cardinal John Lemoyne as his legate to reassert papal control over the French clergy and to invite them to the ecclesiastical council he would hold in Rome in October 1302 to further instigate the French monarchy. Knowing that if he was going to go scorched earth against the Pope, Philip IV would need to convince and have the full backing and support of his subjects, he decided to get ahead of the Pope and call a council of his own. In April 1302, the King of France rallied public support in a large assembly, the very first Estates General. And that's how it all began. A king, Philip IV, rebelling against the representative of God on earth, the Pope, because of taxes and revenue collection. What Philip IV didn't know was that the same mechanisms he had put in motion to wrestle power away from the church in France would be the same mechanisms that centuries later would lead to the demise of the monarchy itself. To finish his story, which is fascinating, after summoning the very first States General, an idea he copied obviously from the English, Philip IV issued a forged copy of the Ausculta Fili, the same decree he had burned down, now under the name Deus Time, fear God. But in this one, the Pope was threatening to take away not just control of the king over his lands, but was going to seize and take away the land of the French people. Cheeky bastard. French people were thus led to believe that the Pope had designs on their private property. The Estates General sent a letter to the cardinals in Rome asking them to overthrow the Pope. Obviously, this didn't happen. Boniface, outraged, excommunicated King Philip IV and issued another bull, this time with the strictest terms of papal supremacy a pope has ever used to assert his authority, the Unam Sanctam. But do you think that Philip IV listened? Nah, he was like, hold my beer. He contacted a couple of his homies, he sent a couple of his agents under Guillaume de Nogaret to Italy to find the Pope. These agents got in touch with relatives of some cardinals the Pope had a falling out with and had punished harshly
They found the Pope hanging out in his palazzo in Agnani in 1303 and proceeded to make him an offer he couldn't refuse. They asked him to abdicate the papacy. But Boniface, being Boniface, he probably tried to have the last word and said something like, "I would rather die." So a man named Sciarra Colonna slapped the Pope in the face so hard, that several weeks later, he died of a stroke. Now, that's a hard slap. Other accounts have Sciarra and his goons beating up the Pope, cutting off his hands, and according to some accounts, even taking out his tongue. Now, we really don't know what they did to the Pope, and I don't think the Vatican is ever going to let us open the tomb of Boniface VIII in order for us to peek and really find out. But a stroke from a slap. Weeks later, hurry. If that's the version of history that history wants us to go with, and that the Catholic Church wants us to go with, well, we're going to go with it. But really? Philip IV would also be responsible 6 months later for helping the next Pope become the new Pope, Benedict XI, who immediately gave him a presidential pardon, released him from excommunication. But trying to reassert papal authority, he could not forgive the Negoré, Felix's chief of staff. Keeper of the seal. So, as a result, he would only last 8 more months on the job and would be poisoned in 1304. Now, I'm not saying that Nogaret did it, but later King Philip would send him on a crusade to expiate his sins. You usually didn't go to Jerusalem to fight for the kingdom of God if you were a good person who didn't have anything to repent from. Although the official version King Philip went with was the slap that Boniface received, not the poisoning of Benedict. Let's get that clear. I don't think that people would ever forgive you if they think that you killed the Pope. What I'm trying to get at is the fact that the next Pope, Clement V, who was neither Italian nor a cardinal, was in France when he was elected, was French, and somehow had a great working relationship with King Philip IV. Some might say he was King Philip IV B, if you know what I mean. He would be the first of the Avignon popes, French popes who ruled the Catholic Church and the Papal Estates from France, and who would claim to be representatives of God on earth for close to 100 years. The Second Estates General met in 1308 in Tours to discuss the suppression of the Templars. You see, King Philip IV not only had problems with the Pope, he decided in 1307 to execute the leaders of the Knights Templar, whom he owed a lot of money to and whom he saw as an increasingly powerful lobby within his kingdom. The cute Knights Templar from Indiana Jones. He had them burned at the stake. In reality, they were not cute and cuddly. They were trained killers in the name of religion, a la Assassin's Creed. But it shows you how much of a badass King Philip IV actually was. In 1316, after the death of Louis X, Philip IV's son, the Estates General was convened once again, this time to discuss the royal succession and the fiscal matters of the kingdom for the first time. Louis X, Philip IV's successor and heir, died while his wife was expecting his first male heir, the future King John I. He already had a daughter, Joan, but we already know how most monarchies working during this time period and how they felt about women in positions of power. They always wanted a boy. King John I, sadly, would only reign for 5 days. He would die of natural causes shortly after being born. And so, upon the baby's death, the representatives of the kingdom gathered once again to discuss his succession, as there was one problem. Joan, the daughter of Louis X, claimed to be the legitimate heir, and Philip, the brother of Louis X, her uncle, who had served as regent while France waited for the new king's birth, also wanted the crown. And he had already gained experience in those couple of months, along with the allegiances of, the most important members and feudal lords in the kingdom. So, as a result, the most notable minds in France gathered once again to make a decision. Philip presented his case, and deducting a law, the Salic laws from the 500s, signed by King Clovis I himself, the Merovingian, if you remember that far back, which bar any woman from ascending to the throne of the Franks, Philip was able to gain the support of the Estates General and be crowned Philip V. We get to see how important the States General had already become. But it wasn't until 1320, when the first States General met at Pontoise and Poitiers, that the Estates General refused for the first time to grant King Philip V the means of bolstering the monarchy's coffers. In other words, in 1320 was the first time that the Estates General wielded autonomy and went against the wishes of the king. Kind of the same thing that happened to Hugh Capet, right? We put you in power, now give us some concessions. Or in this case, we put you in power, now we feel comfortable enough to say no to some of your orders. Another example of the rising, unyielding nature of the Estates General took place in 1355, in the midst of the 100 Years' War, when King John II convened the Estates General in Paris to raise funds to continue fighting against the English. Under the duress of an invasion by Edward III of England, not only did the Estates General approve the funds the king requested, but also added a salt tax proposed by the king. However, the happy collaboration between monarchy and representatives of the people was not to last, as King John II and the French forces suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of Poitiers on September 19, 1356, at the hands of Edward, the Black Prince. King John II was taken prisoner and locked up by Edward III of England and held for ransom. A ransom the Estates General was not willing to pay without further concessions from the French monarchy and the French nobles. Charles de Dauphin, the son of the captured King John II and the future Charles V, refused to yield to the opportunistic requests of the Estates General. These eventually culminated in the Jacquerie, a peasant uprising led by a Paris merchant named Etienne Marseille in 1353. The uprising was brutally put down by the Dauphin and Marseille assassinated in July 1358. Marseille's quick demise and the decisive force with which the Dauphin responded to the pressures of the Estates General brought about a period of absolutism in the crown that would last for close to 100 years. Because of the tumultuous way in which he came to the throne at the end of the 100 Years' War, when it was even doubted if France would even have a French king, Charles VII, who ruled from 1429 through 1461, would never convene the Estates General at all. As a matter of fact, he formalized the collection of the royal taille, a direct tax by the monarchy from all its subjects, which had evolved from the seigneurial taille collected in the earlier years of the 100 Years' War in lieu of military service. During that time, everyone had to either serve or pay, and those nobles who fought and served were exempt from paying the tax. We'll see how that will become a tradition later. But in 468, Louis XI once again convened the Estates General at Tours, reviving the tradition. After his death, the Estates General would meet again at Tours in January 1484, and this time the assembly was composed of 250 individuals, including for the first time representatives of rural areas. Little was accomplished at the Estates General in 1484, and they left with the promise of reuniting again in 1486, but this was never to take place. Even though Louis XII would only convene the Estates General once during his 17-year reign, he would be considered a king of the people, for he ruled as if the members of the Estates General were the ones in power. As a matter of fact, he had never expected to inherit the throne in 1498, and he had even attended the Estates General of 1484 as a member of the Second Estate. During his reign, he made considerable concessions to the people. He reformed the French legal system, he reduced the taxes paid by the people, and supplemented the loss in revenue by lowering the pensions of the nobility and foreign princes, in essence taxing the nobility. He also reinstituted the Pragmatic Sanction, which saw the Holy Roman Catholic Church classified as a Gaelic church, and placed the power of appointment in the hands of the king and other French officials and not the Pope, something which we'll see again take place during the French Revolution. He also codified, through the Ordinances of Blois in 1499, the highly complex French customary law system. In essence, during his reign, he formalized and instituted most of the century-old requests of the Estates General.
However, because the taille imposed by Charles VII was a direct tax collected by the crown itself, the monarchy saw little need to call on the Estates General to have its budgetary needs met. These brought the institution into disuse, and by the 16th century, Francis I, for example, who ruled from 1515 to 1547, never summoned the Estates General either, or never needed to. After his reign, the Estates General would only meet 3 more times, and only in times of crises, such as in 1576 during the Wars of Religion, and in 1614 for a penultimate time during the minority of Louis XIII. In this particular meeting, the monarchy sought to put an end to the sale of offices, which would often be used to enter the ranks of the nobility. But the Third Estate, which benefited greatly from this practice, refused and voted down the request. It would be 175 years before the next, last, and most consequential Estates General would be called again into session in 1789.